We're on, Chris.
Testing.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. So, just in case you don't know who the PPA is, we are the trade body for magazine media. We have about 250 members, and they have over 1,000 editorial trusted editorial brands between them, running across a number of platforms, so print, digital, podcasting, live events, etc. Now, we've had lots of AI on the agenda today, but I am absolutely delighted to be talking to Chris Duncan about the latest in AI, copyright, publishing landscape, big topic. So to introduce Chris formally, previous MD of The Times, CEO of Bauer, so lots of news and mags background there. You're now running your own consultancy.
Yep.
You've also been doing quite a bit of work with us at the PPA, helping us with our own response to the AI consultation. And you've got your own newsletter, which I fully recommend everyone should sign up to. So
You're very kind.
So format for today, we're going to talk between us for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open for questions. So do have a think about what your questions are, get them ready, and we'll come to them at the end. But just to kick it off, and it actually did come up in the last couple of sessions, AI can actually mean lots of different things, right?
Yes.
So why don't we start by spending just a couple of minutes on, what do we mean when we talk about AI? Like, how do we get on the same page about what we're actually talking about today?
So specifically what we're going to talk about today, I think is the three component parts of AI. For me, there's sort of the foundational parts, which is your LLMs, your data centers, and the water and all the rest of it that kind of makes your foundational capability. There's operational AI, which is where you would see things like chatbots, automated kind of activities, but kind of operational. And the third area is what's sometimes referred to as the agentic layer, but if you want that in English, it's really things that are execution engines. So where they're almost given a sort of autonomous ability to go off and execute things. So there's three parts. One which is where all the training happens, one which is where most consumer interaction happens, and then one which kind of goes off and does things for you. That's three. Then you've got two bits underneath that, which is sort of B2B applications. So I think George mentioned, sort of one of the supreme ironies is that terribly clever engineers came up with something that makes lots of them redundant, which is software development and coding. That, to me, is all in the B2B space. And then there's a sort of consumer product world of AI, which is where I'm particularly interested in. The consumer product side of AI is where you are going to see a lot of competition in traditional markets that publishers and news organizations are present in. So if that makes sense, what we're worried about all three of those different building blocks and how they interact, but we're particularly focused on the impact on consumer markets.
Yeah, okay. And if we sort of roll back a year or so, tell us what, in your words, what you think has been happening around the AI consultation. Where are we now? Okay,
so this is going back, is it only a year? I think would be my first point. It feels like something that's been going on for an awful lot longer than that. I'll run through my view of it. There are many of you in the audience who have spent a long time thinking about this. I'm going to skip over some bits that you might like to ask questions about later. But for me, this goes back to the Labour government comes in and says we need to have a growth agenda because the UK economy needs growth. We're going to pick two sectors amongst 8 that we think are going to give us growth, one of which is AI and one of which is the creative sector, one of which is sort of sponsored by DSIT, which is the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and one of which is the creative sector, which is sponsored by DCMS, which has now kind of given up that the digital technology side of what it does. So 2 departments, 2 growth areas. It then commissions a report from a very sensible or a very smart guy, Matt Clifford, who says, if you want to be a big superpower in AI, and it's not often talked about, I don't think, that the UK is the third, generally acknowledged as the third superpower in AI after the US and China, which the easiest way to remember that is that's a good Olympics if you're third in the medal table after the US and China, right? It's not often that the UK is basically in that position. So Clifford comes back and says, I have 50 recommendations. If the UK is genuinely serious about being a superpower, here's the 50 things we can do, one of which is have a legal and copyright framework that supports the development of this industry, but the other 49 are quite significant investments. And Keir Starmer, in one of his earliest kind of decisive strokes, says, I accept all 50 of these recommendations. This is absolutely on the government's agenda. That one sort of action about let's sort out copyright goes to the Patent Office and the Copyright Office, who sort of look up from signing off new types of big biro going, I don't know how we ended up with this, and launch a consultation. The government in that consultation makes, I think, a sort of early, quite fundamental error, which is it hugely leads the witness. And it gives the industry sort of 4 choices, one of which is like they called option 0, because it's so bad, this is a status quo. So the status quo can't continue, and we've got these other 3 options, but the one that we really think we'll go for is giving this sort of exception to AI companies with an opt-out for the creative sector. But we'd really like to consult with you about what that means. Cue kind of uproar, I think, from the creative sectors who felt that it was hugely leading the witness, it was very DSIT biased, and there'd been almost no kind of attempt to represent the creative sector's views in it. So that was kind of, and as a rule of thumb, if you manage to get Elton John and Paul McCartney on your ass in Britain, you've done something terribly wrong, and you're going to get a lot of publicity, and the government, quite rightly, I think did do that. So I think there were 11,000 responses at last count. So 11,000 responses came back to this consultation, and I always just think to myself, someone somewhere is feeding those all into an AI machine to summarise them for them. But they're still kind of deliberating about what that means. I think the government was probably quite surprised by it, by the sort of the reaction that it got. The volume and the sort of ferocity of it. Yeah. And the fact that clearly public opinion was slightly more on the side of, well, hang on a minute, rather than we should go forward with it. So that's now kind of gone into, let's call it, into hibernation. At the same time, it created this issue with something else going through Parliament, which was the data bill, which was in some ways sort of a perfectly innocent bill trying to make its way through Parliament. But it was a data bill at a point when the one thing it didn't talk about was probably the biggest issue in data at the point it was being passed. And quite rightly, some of the Lords representatives, particularly Baroness Kidron, said, you're going to need to amend this. You're going to need to put in things around AI transparency. You're going to need to put in things about the sourcing of data, because this is one of the biggest data issues of the day. And it pinged back and forwards. And again, there's a lot of people have written at great length about how this all worked. But the net result of which is the government eventually passed the data bill, but had to accept that it was going to do a few things. It was going to do more consultation. It was going to have to do a lot of roundtable work, but also it was going to have to create an economic impact study. And this is really important for the publishing industry, because the economic impact study allows the publishing industry to say, well, we are a 2.2 million employee, 124 billion gross value add industry, and we believe if this happens, this is going to be the impact on our markets and our industry. And that number isn't quantified anywhere at the moment.
And so who's creating this study?
It's going to be it gets run by the government, but it means the government pays for the economists, so it's quite helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me what you understand about the recent creative content exchange idea that's been, I think it was a week ago that came out from the government.
Are we Chatham House rules in here, by the way? Can I say everything I would like to say without fear of...
Well, you've got you've got a couple of journalists in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is it shows that the government has not learnt as much from the original consultations they should have done, because this actually came out in the industrial policy document. So this is like another sort of announcement, which is now, we've got an industrial plan, of which I'm broadly supportive, right, that the government should have an industrial ambition. But it's suddenly within the creative sector kind of industrial plan, drops in, we're going to launch this creative content exchange. And as always happens when these things jump, we start furiously emailing around to say, well, who knew about this? Almost nobody in the industry that I could find knew that this was coming around. So it tells you that the government has had sort of, I think it's come off the shelf somewhere. It's been somewhere in discussions like years ago. It's come off the shelf. It's got into the industrial strategy documentation. It's essentially a state-sponsored content licensing setup. And I think I described it the other day. This is a solution to a problem that no one asked for. The only solution that it really is suitable for is if the government wants to license NHS data. And that's not part of the creative sector's industrial policy plan. So I think it's another piece of kind of cack-handed. We kind of want to show that there will help with a licensing idea.
Yeah.
But I assume today is exactly the place people would agree with me when I say I do not believe the answer is a public sector answer to that problem. The answer is creating a meaningful, legally supported market to do that.
Yeah. And so going back to the consultation, how long do you think before we actually are going to receive any feedback on it? And
I think it'll be the end of the summer before there are kind of round tables. I think the round tables will be relatively slow. I think it will drag on into next year. And I have a suspicion that part of the reason for that is because actually the government is acutely aware that it's trying to create a UK kind of legislative regulatory framework, but it's not entirely in control of that because a lot of the rest of the kind of geopolitics of AI are affecting what actually will be effective.
Yeah. So let's pick up on that because this is a global issue. Can you help us, the audience, myself, to understand more about how this is impacting publishers that operate across a number of jurisdictions? Because obviously you've got certain laws in the EU, the US is sort of doing its own thing.
Yeah. I think the easiest way to think about that is sort of the 25 years, of sort of digital in big with a capital D. It's never really had global regulation, and over the last few years, you've really started to see this sort of splintering into, let's call it three major blocks. There's the US, which is broadly libertarian. I'm generalising hugely, but broadly libertarian.
You have called it the splinternet before.
I did call it that. Yeah, I was quite proud of that. The US version, libertarian. The EU version tends to be more privacy conscious and interested in intervention. And then you've got the kind of Chinese-Russian variant, which is autocratic, surveillance-based population control version. The UK sort of jumps between the EU and the US versions, depending on the issues. We're sort of somewhere in between on most issues. And so trying to kind of settle something like AI has become, quite a challenge. There is no clear regulatory global framework. But most of the companies that are creating it, that are monetizing it, and that are sort of building the future of it are global. Most of those are US headquartered. So it creates this sort of awkwardness. The next thing to layer on top of that for AI is all of the big AI players are quite happy to sort of wrap themselves in the flag of national security. One of the phrases you'll hear a lot, particularly from Sam Altwood, we have to do this because otherwise China will. We have to do this faster because otherwise, the People's Liberation Army will have this technology ahead of us. So it's wrapped in national security, and then more recently it's been wrapped in trade, which is, well, actually, if you regulate digital platforms and AI, you're somehow kind of preventing American economic advancement. So the government has to deal with all of that. We know that there is a trade discussion, and in that trade discussion, digital regulation is on the table and kind of being debated. The US wants to kind of water down the Digital Markets Act for the EU. It wants to have a say on that, and it wants to kind of water down the UK's kind of version of Online Safety Act and things like that. So it's geopolitical, and that is one of the factors I think we just have to be conscious of.
And you touched on Magnificent Seven, but they are all US businesses, right?
So the Magnificent Seven, apart from being one of the greatest movies of all time, is the sort of seven stocks that are the big tech players, and I'll always forget one of them, but it's your Googles, Apples, Microsofts, Oracle, whatever. It's 30% of the US S&P 500, which means it's effectively 30% of the kind of their stock market, and more than 50% of the revenue from those companies comes from outside the US. So if you think of it, it's very important that is considered in kind of trade and services. So that plays into the discussions. So when we talk about things like fair use, we theoretically shouldn't care in this room about American copyright or fair use. The reason we have to is because whatever gets decided in the American jurisdiction will affect what the American headquartered companies do by a standard. And the easiest thing in the world would be if the Angels win in America and we can simply adopt those standards, then you don't have a national security and trade impact of it. So that's why we have to be sort of so conscious, I think, of
and
how
just
those
breaking
cases go.
down fair use a little bit. I know you've previously spoken about it being sort of specific to 4 different areas.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, people talk about fair use as if it's the American copyright law. It's not. It's an exception to the US copyright law. So the US copyright law exists and, you know, it does similar things than you would expect. There's an exception that says, having said that, we'll give you exceptions if you do these kind of things. So things like news reporting, research, educational purposes sort of get carved out of it. And so a lot of the AI developer approach has been to say, well, look, we copyright doesn't apply because we have this exception. And all the court cases are really about, can we prove that this should be accepted and therefore doesn't hit copyright regulation? And it's quite a complicated sort of weighting of 4 tests. What's the purpose of the copying that you're doing? Do you get an exception for that? Is it sort of transformative, creating a new thing? Is it, what's the nature of the thing that you're copying? Does that have a lot of protections in it? What's the amount of the thing that you're copying? Are you copying all of it, some of it, bits of it?
Yeah.
To your example, the example George used earlier, if you copy 1 million books, right, that's a lot. So you fail the kind of amount test. And then the last one is the market impact. And this is the most important one, I think, for publishers in the UK and anyone who's involved in licensing to really understand, is the last test is what's the market impact of the copying. So if you can show that the purpose of the copying is just to provide a substitute and sell it on to someone else, you're going to lose fair use. But if you can show that you're creating a new thing out of what you've taken on, you might tick that box. But you have to tick all 4 boxes, and then the judge decides at the end of it what the fair use rating is. Is that? Sorry, I don't know. I'm giving a legal lecture here, but
so
that's how it gets worked out.
There's obviously been several cases, right?
Yeah.
In the US. Which way is it being fair? Like who's winning?
Well, at the moment, it's sort of interesting to watch because, if you like that kind of thing, it's what is happening is
you like that?
I like that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's they've really, there's a couple that have come out at the moment, but there's 45 waiting to come after. And what happens in sort of early, I likened it the other day to a grain of sand, right? The first grain of sand, you can't really, it doesn't make any sense. You've got to wait until you can build up something that then takes shape. So in the early cases, there's been this sort of, I'm not a lawyer, right? So this is just my general personal impression. I would say the cases are leaning towards saying, just taking information that you've paid for and training large language models to understand how language works is kind of transformative, and it doesn't impinge on the markets that those things were intended for. As long as you're not like replicating the books. But if you're using it just to teach a robot to understand grammar, you're probably going to get away with that. That's the leaning of the early kind of parts. Further down, the market impact. I mean, if you really have a quiet weekend, read the Meta kind of judgment, where the judge effectively says, through about halfway through, starts saying, "You've made a terrible argument, and you're not going to win it. If I were you, I'd have made this argument." And I'm really careful by the end of it to say, I want to be really clear that the judgment I'm making only applies to the 7 authors who've brought this case. And any other author out there, anyone, could make the argument I've just made and they would have a better case. Right? So as I say, the arguments, this is 2 of 47. By the time you get to about the 20s, you'll really get a sense of, I think, how it's developing.
Yeah. Okay. Should we touch on business models? How are publishers thinking about, the business models? How are you seeing sort of licensing roll out? What are the commercial implications or opportunities around AI?
Licensing-wise, a real mix. A lot of big publishers have done deals that they are kind of, I don't think it's any great secret. I haven't seen many publishers who've done deals that they are absolutely thrilled with. I think there's a lot of publishers who've done deals who think that it's important to have gone through the process of doing the deals, that they've established some kind of legal precedent, that they have got some monetization out of it.
Does it not seem to be slowing down though? As in,
Yeah.
there was a real kind of flurry of them, and then that's really
Yes, because if you go back, it's happened before in Australia with the news bargaining code. What the large tech companies will do, quite sensibly, is they will say, from their point of view, is they'll say, if I can buy like the biggest 8 publishers, I probably get 80% of the content. Actually going and dealing with everybody else, it's quite hard, and I'm not sure I really get that much value out of it. And by the way, the top 8 are the ones that make all the noise and have all the influence.
Yeah.
So it's quite a sensible strategy from their point of view, and that's why you see it slow down.
Okay.
So there are deals being done.
Yeah.
I think there are probably a lot of publishers, particularly in the middle sort of segment and the smaller publishers, who are a bit like, well, where is this going to leave us? And unfortunately, until the kind of sheepdog of regulation creates a bit more pressure, I think that's very uncertain. So licensing-wise, I think it's pretty clear also that the licensing, the value of those licensing deals is a nice-to-have amount of money. It's not a business. And that's really important to remember that, because what it means is, from a business model perspective, publishers may be able to get some additional revenue from licensing their content in the same way that they get additional content from events or a wine club or other kind of things that come into the business, but it's not enough to live on. So they also need to protect their main business model. And I think in that world, AI is providing a fantastic automation and cost reduction impact. Most publishers are using it for reducing kind of automating process steps in publishing, creating things. It's pretty good at doing graphic design. It can do full page spreads in mags much better than it used to be able to do. So taking out cost, that will lengthen the life of print for a lot of publishers. The flip side of that is they're seeing the impact on discovery. So from a business model perspective, going to digital, 2 things are happening at once. One is both Google and Meta and other large platforms are kind of throttling the traffic that they're sending back to publishers, which is the digital platform world. But generative, it's pretty clear that if people are getting answers from generative AI chatbots, that does not result in traffic coming back to publisher sites.
And are you seeing that there's certain types of content or certain sort of specialist areas that are more at risk, if you like, than others?
Other way around, actually, I would say. I think generalist is more at risk. So if you're a really specialist, if you're in a really good B2B niche, if you kind of really own an area of specialism, if you have personalities, if you have famous columnists, if you have all these sort of things that can't be replicated, you create small moats and niches that you can protect in your business.
Yeah.
If you're kind of just knocking out general news, and every day there's going to be 50 competitors for that, and actually the thing that you're reporting on could be answered by a summarized version, that you're really in trouble.
Yeah. We are ready to go to some questions from the audience. Who would like to go first? Any questions out there? Got one at the back.
You're very shadowy up the back, by the way. If you got in the last 5 rows, you're like, it's like a Bond film up there.
Hi, Mariana Serapico, Springer Nature. I have a question about, you said AI being geopolitical. I wanted to know how you feel like it's going to affect, how AI can affect inequality worldwide, and how that will impact publishing as well.
That's a very large question.
Yeah.
How it can affect inequality, it's an interesting question. I do worry, this is a personal thing, I do worry that if you think about the sort of utility of AI tools and agents, and you think about the ability of kind of parts of the population to use those to become much more effective, and then there are large parts of the population that won't necessarily use those tools, but maybe engaged by the output of those tools, you can see a kind of terrifying world where you end up with an elite, for want of a better word, kind of becoming much more productive and successful, while a large part of the population is kind of seeing employment go down, and they're sat watching Meta's god-awful synthetic video while wondering what happened. There is that danger. I don't think that's I think I would say politely, I'm not sure that's a PPA issue. It's not something that the publishing industry is going to solve itself. Where I think it can help, the publishing industry can help with that issue, is it can do a much better job. News and publishing and magazines at the moment are doing, I don't think, a very good job of reporting on the implications of AI and the policy choices that are being made around it, and the movements of the platforms, in how they're kind of engineering it. I think they can do a better job on that front.
Thank you.
Any more questions? One up on there.
Hello, I'm Dominic Young.
Hello.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about trust, because one thing I've noticed just anecdotally in my day-to-day life is people are much, much more suspicious of stuff they're finding on the internet. My wife the other day asked me if I thought the story was true, and it turned out it was, but it took a little while. And the first thing I saw about the Indian plane crash was a genuine bit of footage that was labelled as fake. So in both directions, people are getting more suspicious of what they're finding on the so-called open web. And I'm wondering if this creates an opportunity for publishers, firstly, to really play up trust and accountability in their publications, but secondly, to start to collaborate with each other and to start to create user journeys. We've always been very apart, right? There's a zero-sum game. We don't like sharing. We talk about owning users. We don't ever talk about sharing them, although we used to in shops. We didn't, have a special shop just for our own product. I'm wondering if there's a flip side to this AI thing, which is it actually creates a bit more of a separation between the content people are paying for, investing in, and being accountable for, and AI polluting everything else. And is that an opportunity?
I think it is an opportunity. I think I sort of think about so I'd say we didn't do a very good job, I don't think. We made decisions. We have made decisions as publishers, and I've made lots of them. So I'm not sort of trying to say I could have done a better job. I was there, and I did some of these things. But there was an early decision to say we were going to allow search to index our sites, and in return we would get traffic. And you and I have talked about this for a while. That was a good decision at the time, but it had implications. And later on, it turned out to do a lot of other things we didn't see. One of the other things we did was we allowed, when we could have said, I'm not sure Google is going to save us. Maybe Meta will save us. They seem like good guys. Why don't we allow our content to be placed alongside user-generated content? And it's a new distribution channel for us. But actually what happened in that was it really ended up with our content being placed alongside user-generated, brand-generated, and advertising content. And the line between those four types just blurred. And I think there was a fundamental at that point. We lost the separation of sort of curated, sourced, trusted professional journalism and content. And that's gone on for a while, and we haven't really been able to quite break out of that. I think that what you've got now is potentially a triangulation, which is machine-generated content. And that allows you to it's very hard to sort of draw the line between, well, this is a professional journalist, and this is someone who writes, but they're not quite that's quite difficult. Saying this has been produced by a machine, this has been produced by 100 people in a newsroom who can tell you that this is true. There's a real opportunity there for publishers to make that come to life, and there are ways they'll need to think about that. But I think it is a huge opportunity. Just be careful though. Always, the public is a fickle pickle, and if you look at some of the studies that are coming out at the moment, they'll say on the one hand, God, it's really hard to trust anything on the internet. And also, I spend 8 hours a day looking at content I don't trust. And also, the quality of it is getting much worse. And also, I'm spending more time on it. And 48% of people say, I wish Instagram had never been affected in a survey they filled in on Instagram. So, we'll tread lightly.
Yeah. Lydia?
Thank you for the conversation so far. It's been really, really interesting. I'm going to pick up from the last question and then ask a question of my own. So it's about the first thing about opportunity to distinguish between real and fake and really sort of build that relationship of trust. There is C2PA. People might have heard of it. It's an initiative that was set up by Adobe, BBC, and New York Times to distinguish between real and fake content. There's a little icon that indicates whether something is real or fake. So we've been using that standardization to add additional metadata, including about copyrights licensing and text and data mining opt-out. And my question is about TDM, actually. Because, and please don't think me a bad person for doing this. Okay, I'm not against you guys, but I wanted to ask more about TDM and just clarify that as the technologist that's building solutions to help rights owners, I need to keep an eye on like changing legislation. And TDM is something that was discussed before this government. It was around since 2022. Yep. And because the discussion is old and because what the European Union have already done, I got the strong feeling that pragmatically, we're probably going to have some kind of TDM. So we already have TDM, but have it more liberal than it currently is. In what form, I don't know. What do you make of that?
Sure. I mean, I think the point about TDM was always, to me, the difference between TDM and what we're talking about with AI is always about the actual usage of it. So it was very clear that the purpose of the TDM exception was to say, sometimes you're going to need to look across lots of bits of data and maybe even copy some of it and maybe do this just in order to do something else. So if you want to create a search index, you have to read all the data and you have to kind of mine it. And, you know, if you want to look at... So there were reasonable exceptions. I think it doesn't quite cover the kind of purpose and usage that we're talking about here. So I think it's an interesting building block. And the building block is that it sort of says, well... You know, we know that actually allowing people to read lots of publicly available information and do something else with it is something that we might allow. And I think most of the debate that we're having is to say, yeah, we might. What we probably don't want to allow, though, is reading information that we made available in one set of terms and conditions to do a completely different thing, to create a product that competes directly in the market that we exist for, and create competitive products that eventually kill us. That isn't in the original TDM kind of exception. That was never what it was about.
C2PA has 4 different categorizations of TDM, by the way, and that's really interesting because there's generative output, which everybody's quite concerned about. There's sort of extracting patterns, there's object recognition, which people might be okay with. So it nicely tries to distinguish between the AI use cases.
There's one thing I didn't mention, and I'll do this super quick. Venture capital works brilliantly by basically saying to large companies like most of the AI developers and the Googles and the Metas, we will allow you to run in a market for a period of time without a viable revenue model. And in that time, you'll build up an audience and a habit, and you will kind of establish your presence in markets. And then exactly at the point that we have reached market penetration to a sufficient level, we will start to introduce revenue, which means pricing, which means consumers having to do something or advertisers having to pay something, right? And we are in that phase of AI. So I would say to you're going to ask me in a minute, I think, what would I say to publishers? And I would say, just be really acutely aware that we are in the pre-revenue phase of AI, right? That there are all of the reason that these products go out for free first is to build usage, dependency, integration, you know, all of the things that mean that later on you can create pricing. There are 2 methods that will go down. You will either be paying a subscription for your assistant, or you will be looking at adverts that are, you know, cleverly kind of suggested by your assistant. There has to be a revenue model, right? And so the TDM exception also was really about, I mean, it was predominantly about kind of research and other things. It was not about creating market competitive, revenue generating, consumer funded product. And that's to come. So just, you know, I just would implore all publishers to have that in your mind, that this won't be free forever. And that's, you know, that's where we're headed next.
Chris, of all the many genres of fiction and non-fiction and other areas of publishing, if you were starting a company or investing in a particular sector, which would you double down on and which would you be careful about because it's most vulnerable to AI?
Great question.
I would double down on probably on B2B niches. I think B2B is like, I think there are some fantastic businesses that have really close industry connections. The other thing they have, B2B niches tend to also have the support of their own trade. So they're kind of almost protected from within. So I would be buying shares in, I'm not allowed to give share, I'm not giving share advice. This is not financial advice. But I would say Informa, for example, is a very, is a business that keeps itself very quiet. It's a fantastic business, and is invested in some very strong niches. And I think that would be a place I would look. I'd be pretty worried about local journalism, although I do think they've got an odd, some things that they have fallen out of the habit of doing, like court reporting, AI might actually bring back. So there may be an opportunity to kind of do that, but I think that's a tough model. Very, very broadly, I think it's always good to be big because you've got time and money and funding. It's, at the moment, never been easier to be small. You can have a 1 or 2 person business that creates fantastic content and can get to an audience and can monetize it. The tough ones for me at the moment are in the middle. 100 people companies where you've got overheads, you have to have an ad sales team, you have to have a tech stack, you've got all the costs, but your scaling of revenue is quite difficult. So that's roughly where I'd look.
Thank you. Great question. Graham, did you have your hand up?
Very quick one, yeah. Yeah, it's Graham Lovelace again from Charting Gen AI. Chris, where do you think the big idea might come from, and what indeed might the big idea be? Could publishers gang together, for instance, and create their own large language model as a cooperative venture, rather than, again, leaving it to the Americans to do as they did with the web, with search, with mobile, everything?
Yeah, I think, so product is very interesting. I would say, so I came out of Bauer and I turned 50 and I was like wandering around in my garden crying and, doing all the things you do as a... but you kind of look back, and I'm old enough now to look back and think, well, my career started about 97, 98. So it was the beginning of the dawn of the commercial internet. I actually remember, if there are very young people in the audience, I remember being crowded around a computer watching an email come in and going, bloody hell, what do we do now? Like, what do we do next? Do you think anybody else has got one of these? So, you've kind of watched over that period things develop. I think when you look back over that kind of time frame, publishing product pretty much stops in about 2012. There isn't really much that's happened in terms of an iPhone kind of application, a publishing format. Maybe you could argue video, audio, podcast kind of, but there hasn't been a great leap forward. So I'm trying to think about at the moment, what can that be? I think there's going to be a sort of fork in the road between those publishers that offer utility and those that offer engagement and entertainment. If you're in the utility space, the ability to create your own assistant, the ability. So I was talking to somebody at the FT yesterday about the idea that, so the Rachel Reeves story broke yesterday. The value of organisations like the FT and the Times is to work out what it means, not that it's happened. But at the point that it happens, if I were able to just flag in, whatever assistant I'm using, I'd like to know more about that. When you know something, when Martin Wolf has something interesting to say about it, let me know. So this kind of conversational, slightly more interactive kind of version of a news assistant, a persistent news assistant, won't be the title of it, but there's some, you get the idea of the product. So there's this huge opportunity for product development. The ability to kind of find new stories through the use of AI, the ability to search Companies House and find, all kinds of things. Huge opportunity, I think, for new story generation. So I'm pretty optimistic about it. The third part, and Dom sort of alluded to this earlier, is I don't think I've ever, in the time that I've been in the industry, seen publishers more willing to genuinely collaborate. And I mean that. I've sat in a lot of meetings in the early part of my career where we went because we were told to, but we had no intention of collaborating, and that was our brief. But in later years, I genuinely think that publishers recognise that they are under existential threat. And that we are rarely now competing, for long-term customers. We're competing against, different technologies and different territories. So I'm pretty optimistic about industry-level solutions coming along that help us advance that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
We are out of time, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask one more question. You mentioned earlier that the consultation is likely to sort of go on beyond the summer. You know, we talked about, you know, the opportunity for publishers, and, you know, but what I would like to ask is sort of what can we be doing proactively in that time as publishers to kind of, you know, be ready for whatever we need to do on the other side of the summer?
Sure. I would say think like an economist, think like a lawyer. So the first thing is one of the traps that people fall into with competition law and this kind of government consultation is, you know, gnashing your teeth and wailing and crying and sort of saying how awful it all is very interesting, but the economists just strike through all of that and say there's no harm here, right? You know, your feelings are not economically interesting. So I would say right from this point onwards, and again, this is a mistake that we made first time around with the digital platforms, every strategy document that you write, every budget submission that you put in, every internal email that you send on this subject, you need to be reinforcing the fact that there are market harms, that you are faced with an environment in which you are competing with these technologies, that, you know, you need to be really clear that there is a dilution of the potential market for your products in the event that these things come true. Because at some point, there's going to be a document discovery stage, and you're going to have to show that you genuinely thought that. And I say, one of the mistakes we made quite early on as publishers was when the Google cases first started coming around, they said, well, where in your document does it say this? No one had ever written it down. So make sure you're thinking about that. Have a clear view about where your kind of which markets are being affected. Keep a record and a document of all the numbers that you see, the reports that tell you that that's happening. That would be the first thing. That's quite granular. The second thing would be, I think as leaders in the industry, we are going to have to, it's a very tough period of time, right? Market trading is tough. Hitting our quarterly numbers is tough. Most of our bosses are tougher. And so, you know, it's very easy to get distracted into hitting the quarterly numbers that you need to hit. You've got to carve some time out to think about if there is going to be a generational shift, if Google is going to be broken up and generative AI is going to take over discovery at the same time in your lifetime, your leadership team needs to spend some time thinking about that problem as a really fucking big question.
Yeah.
Right? Call your session that. But you need to do that. You need to do that. And you won't do that by adding it 5 minutes at the end of your management meeting.
And Google is already preparing for a world without search, right?
Yep. Google Remedies will come in August. It will be broken up. You will see the first genuinely competitive market in search and ad tech in 20 years, sometime in the middle of 2026.
Wow. Thank you, Chris,
Pleasure.
for speaking to us. Hope you enjoyed the session.